the construction phase. Now what? And our invited presenters have a wealth of project-specific experience, and they're experts in this mysterious, sometimes fuzzy, phase of restoration, which can include post-construction adjustments, which we sometimes call adaptive management, and other activities that are ongoing for the life of the project. And those we would label maintenance. So in general, I wanted to kick us off a little bit structurally. As I said, we have a number of folks joining us for the first time, and some folks that have been involved in the network from the beginning. So I wanted to ask everybody to take a quick second, and before we dive into the flow of the webinar, to just take this quick poll. It's through a site called Mentimeter. You shouldn't need a login or anything to be able to complete it. So you could scan it with your phone here from the screen, or I believe the link was also posted in the chat. Just bear with me a second. I will switch screens and we'll look at the results of that poll if they're coming in. So the question is, describe your level of experience with the practice of restoring marshes and coastal habitats with dredge sediment. So that's what we mean when we say beneficial use. So we understand that beneficial use of dredge material can extend beyond this narrower view of it. But in this group, we focus on coastal marshes. Give a couple more beats for folks to finish filling this out. And in general, I think that's really helpful to know who's in the room and what individuals' levels of experience are. It's really good to see we have folks with some beneficial use experience here. Those tend to be, as I said, the network really started to help project teams share information amongst themselves. And so that doesn't surprise me at all that we have a lot of experience here. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to switch screens back, share this with the post-meeting materials. And my other task, before I introduce our speakers, was to just run through the flow of the day. All right. So we have several web goals for this webinar and your participation in it. We wanted to take this opportunity to introduce 2 elevation enhancement projects that are located on the south coast of Rhode Island. So Wenley Ferguson has graciously come and share her experience based on those 2 projects. The projects we haven't had the opportunity to highlight yet in the Learning Network. So the goals are kind of twofold of meet the projects and understand that they're great examples for this adaptive management phase and those activities. We're hoping to be able to share different methods and approaches to figure out or assess when adaptive management or when maintenance activities are triggered. So we'll discuss kind of that observational type of data or what kinds of information project teams are looking at on the site to make the decisions that they're making for adjustments. Or for maintenance. And I think overall, we're looking to manage participants' expectations of this post-construction phase. So be ready for everything that could be coming and to be as prepared as possible. So just a quick flow. I've gone over my 5 minutes already. On the welcome, Bart Wilson from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has graciously offered to provide us our official introduction to this topic. And I mentioned Wenley Ferguson from Save the Bay will be providing us some Rhode Island project examples and introducing us to two of her projects or 2 of the projects she's worked on. So presentations will take about 30 minutes overall. After that, they'll be joined by several other panelists. We have Lisa Ferguson from the Wetlands Institute and Suzanne Payton from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Southern New England to be joining for the moderated panel discussion portion, where I'll be asking questions of our panelists. And there'll be an opportunity then too for participants to ask the panel questions before we wrap up. So that's our next 2 hours together. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and ask Bart to introduce himself and then our topic for the day. Thanks, Bart.
Thank you. As it was introduced, I'm going to be kind of giving like a broad introduction into maintaining your restoration sites. And I think, you know, Winley and I have worked together for a long time, and we had talked about what's a good flow to talk about this. So I'm going to kind of go from the, 30,000 view, bring in a couple project examples, and then the two projects that Winley's going to talk about is going to really kind of reinforce some of the discussion that I've had. Now, I will say there's some ground rules for the discussions today and moving forward for people that I want to like some take-home messages. So, I think let's take the TL out of the TLP. I really think, elevation enhancement is the one thing we should start talking about. It's not really, I think there's some semantics when you talk about thin layer and what's thin layer, and, elevation enhancement is just an easy way to kind of think about what we're doing. Because I think that's, as you see with some of these projects, it gets, thin and thick is a relative term. Now, one of the main things that we want to talk about is, adaptive management versus site maintenance. I think these are terms that are not necessarily well identified, and I think they can be misused. We see that a lot about, we talk about adaptive management, and people are talking about adaptive management 5-6 years in the future, and sometimes they're actually talking about site maintenance. And I think making some of those clear distinctions that hopefully we'll talk about today can kind of help with how you think about your project in the short term, middle term, and long term, and how you kind of need to think about investing in it. And I think with adaptive management, site maintenance, we're talking about vegetation, invasive species control, hydrology, grading of the material. So I think it's it can be a pretty big list of things that we need to think about. I think adaptive management and site maintenance are actions that will aid in guiding our project toward a level of success. I think that's the way you need to look at these things. How these kind of fit in the regulatory and implementation world is, that's where it gets a little bit unclear. But I think it's a good way to kind of think about these, because sometimes I think we get caught up in that, adaptive management and site maintenance need to be things that we're guiding it towards our design or our prescription. And sometimes you need to take a step back and say, well, what do we need to do to make sure this project is functioning naturally? And I think that's where we kind of get caught up too much in like, oh, I need to create my design, rather than let me work with my site to develop the best hydrology, the best vegetational response by what's given to me, or what the final product looks like. Because I think that's what we're talking about. Your contractor puts a whole bunch of sediment on your site, and you're kind of like, well, now what? And I think that's where Winley's some of her examples really kind of go towards, it's not as easy as just kind of like, oh, let's go plant some plants and put in a channel and we're good to go. It's, we're talking about years. Adaptive management is in year terms, which is interesting. So, and I think one of the big things I like to think about is that, we're talking about ecosystem-based restoration. And if you think it in that terms, that makes adaptive management more of a comprehensive view of like gradients and trajectory. So there's like kind of like, oh, there's an end state. And I think sometimes, again, we get caught up too much in like, oh, I need a 50% vegetation response. I need an 80% vegetative response by 4 years. And I think we want to think about more of it like, are we going in the right direction? And sometimes we want to just kind of like tweak the system to get towards an equilibrium. And in that, like with hydrology, you want the tide to flow in and out of the site naturally. You don't want to get stormwater or rainwater caught up in areas. So sometimes you're tweaking it to get the system to just function, and not necessarily, again, prescribing how you want it to function. You want it to kind of work with the system. And I think another thing to kind of think about is that monitoring, we are talking about qualitative and quantitative metrics and methods. And unfortunately, we have best intentions of doing huge monitoring plans. But one of the things that ends up happening is that we have to make adaptive management decisions on qualitative assessment, because the quantitative data is either years out from having enough data to kind of make a decision, or it's the scope and scale of it just isn't representative of the decisions we make. And I use sets as an example where we have surface elevation tables all throughout a lot of these marshes, but there's actually quite a bias to them. Not only do you need several years of data to actually get something that's usable to show a trend, but one of the things we've actually seen in these projects is not only do they differentially capture sediment so that it's artificially mounded, sometimes they also create ponding areas for water. So they're not really truly representative of the greater project you're looking at. So, not only do they inherently create a bias in using it in general, but in restoration sites, it may be even worse. So it's like, to me, it's one of those things where you may also want to take a step back to make sure some of your monitoring that's going to go into your adaptive management decision-making is representative in the time scale you need to make those decisions. So, adaptive management versus site maintenance. Adaptive management, occurs throughout the restoration. So again, you could have adaptive management not only in, your site as it's actively being restored, sediments being, put out. And I think one of the big things we see with that is the variations in quantity. How do you adapt to more or less available sediment in your project? If you're designing a project with sand and you're designing for 50,000 cubic yards and you suddenly get 80,000 cubic yards, what do? So I think that's one of the things to kind of think in the back of your mind about when you have a design in these types of projects, have some, forethought to kind of think about how we can kind of scale the project and vary it. And that's adaptively managed to just sediment on the site. And I think having less sediment is another way to think about that. An example of this that we're seeing now is Sapona Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, where, it's a project where initially we were going to get 100,000 cubic yards of mixed grain material. Then it was 150. Now it's 210,000 cubic yards. But one of the things we did at the beginning of the project was figuring out how much material the basin could take. We figured out it was 400,000 cubic yards. So having excess material, not a bad thing. This is great. We can kind of scale our project and think about it differently. So, and again, when we think about this, we're thinking, hydrology layout, planting plan. These are aspects of a project that, you have a design when you go into it or an idea of what you want to do, but it doesn't necessarily end at one point when you kind of, plant the plants. There's a lot of variation to it. So I think when we talk about adaptive management and site maintenance, where does one end and the other begin? And I think that's where it may be a different distinction for people, but I think we need to make that distinction because I think from, a funding standpoint, responsibility standpoint, there is an end state of one and how it transitions to the other. And I think that's kind of good to think about because again, we do want to we're going to need to tweak the system before it meets an equilibrium. But once we kind of get that equilibrium, you may have to go back in and clean out a channel or replant an area or do some invasive species control. And that's really now we're entering that site maintenance standpoint. So again, another thing to think about with this is, what triggers adaptive management? Again, in that idealized world, extensive quantitative monitoring data. In the reality, it's qualitative observations. And I think that's one of the biggest things that when we think about how we think about adaptive management and the plans we submit for regulatory review, be realistic in what you're submitting. Because you can say, oh, we're doing all this years of data collection that we're doing this. That's not really the case, especially let's say with hydrology or grading the material. You're going to go out there and look at it and see, okay, I'm having water ponding over there. I have this berm that blew over, so I need to kind of cut a channel through it. I need to regrade that. And I think you need to be realistic in the conversations you're having because that's the reality of how it's done. I think that's, and Wenley's going to show that really. So site stability is one of the biggest things we're talking about with your site. So when you're thinking about adaptive management and then the maintenance of it, you're thinking about the stability of the site. So grading in sand projects, you're going to have to do some grading because, the sediment is placed by the contractor. But then once he's, done, once they're done, you may have to do some additional grading to get it to where you want it to be to suit your needs. And then the equipment needs for that are a huge part of this. Again, you may have a certain amount of time you want to put into this, but if you don't have the right equipment, it may take longer. The stability, the site hydrology, the initial construction of the hydrology needs to be adaptive. So you may have a layout in mind, but that final layout may not resemble the original plan because after you do a bunch of grading, after you kind of really see where the water's flowing naturally, that may vary significantly in how your kind of the final layout looks. And I think it's good to think about, hydrology, we may be talking 2 to 3 years before it's really functioning as you want it to. And that's just because, again, the material you're using, the conditions of the site really have a lot to play into that. And then once you get a site that's the hydrology functioning, so again, the water's moving in and out, you get the layout you want it to, it's kind of representative kind of what's going on in the conditions, then that's where you're talking about, okay, now we need to maintain it. It's slumping in, let's maintain it. And this is a really important point. Until you get the hydrology and the grading done, I wouldn't even consider planting. Again, planting of a site really needs to be done after a lot of those key components are done, but you might end up doing some planting targeted to maybe stabilize channels or create some windrows like Wenley will talk about. But a lot of times if you're talking about, grading or trying to redo your hydrology, you may be like pushing material over plants that you planted. And then for fine grain projects, you may be waiting 1 to 2 years before the site consolidates enough to be able to kind of do that hydrology. And, for site planting, once you get to planting, we always have planting plans, like a typical section, but, a lot of times, how do you work with a typical or an absolute? A lot of times we have an absolute, but then the site may look completely different, so it's not valid. So, think about a typical planting plan where, okay, these are the elevation ranges, we'll plant the stuff. Roughly, we're going to do it here. And I think that helps us to kind of be a little bit more adaptive to the site. And for an example of that, if it'll advance, for some reason it's not advancing. Here's an example of a planting plan for the back area of Bombay of Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge. And again, we had these layouts in the top pane of like, here's all the zonation, and then we had a lot of the different planting ideals. When the project was completed, why is it not advancing? There we go. This is actually what the planting plan looked like for the back barrier. Completely different because we had variations in quantity and grading. So the whole planting ideal got thrown out the window. And this is one of those things where if the initial planting plan was just more of a typical section, not an absolute planting plan, this wouldn't have been a headache. And it turned out to be a little bit of a headache trying to work with the contractor to get what fit the situation versus planting what was on the plan. So one of the other kind of adaptive ways another example here is that when we think about adaptive management, we're thinking about how the site's going to respond. You have an idea of how it wants to respond. There are aspects of this that we may not initially envision. How does that work into our idea? So here's an example in Prime Hook where we had to side cast all the material onto one side. It kind of got built up more than we really wanted. And one of the things that happened is we ended up having to go in and do some hydrology restoration of that area with mosquito control, because after the area kind of dried out, it looked like this. It was desiccated. It was much higher than we wanted it to be. It was going to, if we did nothing, it was going to turn into a frag jungle. We were already getting, the desiccation cracks. You were getting where there was water, you were getting extensive mosquito breeding. So again, we didn't have in our plans that we were going to do a channel network through here, but kind of kept it open within our language of our adaptive management plan and our site plan. We could implement these things as needed throughout the site. So that's what we did. So we were able to go in there and put in 12,000 linear feet of channels through the area. We cut channels, we cut dead end areas to allow the water to kind of overbank and help use that salt to push frag back. We did tidal pools, and this is kind of like, post-construction, it looked like this, and this is one of the things we use to, as a monitoring tool for this. We use satellite photography because it was the best way to look at, okay, what's our channel layout? 4 months post-construction, we could see wetting, we could see revegetation, and then, 4 years later, we could see that the site is completely revegetated. So for our needs, just using aerial photography was the best way to look at the site of the response, because we had such a huge area we needed to look at. This really helped us to kind of capture all that information. With runnels, I think another aspect that's interesting is that, here's examples from a runnel restoration project in Reeds Beach, Cape May, where sometimes, you're trying to find a balance of, let's say, restoring a hydrology to the marsh, something that's natural, sometimes we may over prescribe channels. And I think this might be the area, what we saw in this area where, we were monitoring the elevation and the depth of these channels over time. And in some areas, the channels maintained their depth, water was moving through it. But we also had in some areas, the channels just filled in immediately. But water was still kind of draining from the area, but the channels filled in. And that might be an indicator that we were over-prescribed channels. We had too many channels in the area, and it was kind of interfering with each other where either it was draining too much or it was just not a really effective drainage pattern. Again, hydrology restoration can look a lot different. So that adaptive management piece and maintenance can look a lot different for your sites. These are all ways that hydrology was adaptively managed at these sites doing different techniques. It can also be a shovel, but the maintenance can look exactly the same way. You could be using the same exact equipment for your maintenance as your adaptive management, because if you already have a channel network and you just need to keep it open, you may be coming up with the same thing. So again, think about that when you're kind of talking to the permitters about this. So just one more slide here. So I think permitting funding are a key aspect of this. So how do, when we think about adaptive management, we are including adaptive management into some of our initial permits, but I don't think we're being representative of the timescales that we were talking about. Give ourselves more time, but site maintenance is another one. So do we need a permit for site maintenance? I mean, I'm sure a lot of regulatory people say, yes, absolutely. Well, when do we get that? Do we have to get a permit every year when the problem's already here and we're like rushing to be like, we need to open up the channel? Do you need to start thinking about a 10-year maintenance permit during concurrent with construction permits so it's all lined up and you can kind of just do what needs to be done, especially with an adaptive management plan? It can flow right into almost a maintenance plan to kind of make sure that they're working in tandem. So I think the other thing is think about construction footprint and maintenance footprint. And I'll have one slide on that where they may not be the same. So again, usually we kind of have a very focused construction footprint. Sometimes we may need to have a larger footprint for maintenance because of effects outside of that zone that we need to fix. So I think, and I kind of mentioned some of this, but, I think post-constructive adaptive management is a real issue for us with grant funding. Usually we shoehorn it in there, but with these grant windows of 2 to 3 years, we may not be doing our planting and are finishing our adaptive management hydrology for 2 to 3 years, let alone planting in year 3 or 4. So if we're putting that into a grant, a lot of times we end up just having to throw the money, spend it quickly because we need to spend out the grant, versus do we need to start talking to some of the grant agencies and saying, this is our implementation grant for sediment placement. Now we need a grant to do our adaptive management or give us a longer timeline. Instead of 2 years, we need 5 years for this grant to actually adequately implement the project. One example, so this is some channels that we dug outside. This is actually outside of our construction footprint in the northern part of Prime Hook, but these were areas that were not functioning that we had to clear out after construction. So these weren't in our initial construction footprint, but we quickly realized that and we're able to modify our initial permits to include this area. So again, we could do these, side cast the channels, and then, 2 years later, you could see the channels are open. You can't even really see where the side cast areas are. So closing thoughts, another aspect is this adaptive management. We also need to think about who is doing it. Adaptive management and site maintenance isn't necessarily the contractor that's putting the sediment on the site or the Army Corps or whoever it is. A lot of times it's the land manager, or you need to start making new partnerships for, again, especially adaptive management to site maintenance. It may be your local mosquito control. It may be a private landowner. Those are the things we need to start thinking about what that really looks like. And, as Adriana and I both like to get on soapboxes, as we always joke, one of those things I like to do is, why can't we let nature guide us in adaptive management? We do use regulations, grant deadlines, and patience to dictate the trajectory. And I think that kind of is an artificial thing that can kind of make this harder, where you're fighting the direction that the project wants to go. You're fighting it to some design, and then you're just kind of, it's a losing effort versus working with. All right. So after that, I'm now going to turn it over to Wenli, who is going to talk about Ninigrit and Quani, and a lot of the aspects that she's learned from them on adaptive management site maintenance.
Thank you so much, Bart, for that lightning round introduction to the variety of ways techniques that adaptive management and site maintenance can take on. And so one of the tenets of the Learning Network is, there's all of these concepts and there's lots of examples, but the examples really start to bring these concepts home. And so we're grateful that Wenli is here to share these 2 projects with us. So take it away, Wenli.
Thank you, Adriana, and thanks all for tuning in today. We were out on a marsh yesterday, and it's kind of nice to be inside today. I will tell you that. So Caitlin Chafee, my colleague who used to work at the Coastal Resources Management Council, that's why their logo's below her name. She couldn't join us today, but CRMC was the lead project proponent, and Save the Bay was a partner with CRMC. Caitlin now is with the Estuarine Research Reserve, and we still collaborate together on restoration projects, and she's still involved with Bart and myself on writing up some of the lessons learned from these 2 projects that we collaborated on together. So in Rhode Island, we've done in the last 7 years 4 elevation enhancement projects, and I was calling them sediment placement. I have the same. To me, TLP is a bad acronym. I'd always get mad at my project partners because the work that we did at Ninigret and Quaney, it was not thin layer placement. And so it's good to describe these projects more. What is the goal in enhancing the elevation of these degraded salt marsh platforms? So U.S. Fish and Wildlife did the first project over here at Satchwest Refuge in Middletown. They actually used land-based sediment and brought it from the upland into the marsh, and then did a restoration dredging similar to what we did at Ninigret and Quaney at the Narrow River Chafee Refuge. And Nick Ernst is with us today from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and maybe that could be a future case studies we discuss. But today I'm going to talk about Ninigret, which is on one of our coastal salt ponds in Rhode Island with man-made breachways, and Quanaketag Pond, which I'll refer to as Quaney. So just quickly, the Ninigret project started in, I put my phone on silence. The Ninigret project started 2016. Our dredge window is mid-October through January 31st. And the contractor got going right around just after Thanksgiving, took a break for Christmas, and was out of there by late January. Similar to the Quaney project, that was 2016. Ninigret, Quaney was 2 years later, 2018 to 19. Both were restoration dredging projects. We got funding from Ninigret from the Sandy funds through Department of Interior. And we also had some U.S. Fish and Wildlife funds as well. Suzanne Payton, who's here with us today, she was representing the lead federal agency, which was U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And then acreage, you can see Quaney, similar, a little bigger. We were working on in 2 areas along, again, a man-made breachway, and NOAA was our lead funder. But again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife was involved, and we had state and local partners. The town was involved in helping to fund it, as well as our local Habitat Restoration Trust Fund. So here's Ninigret. You can see the breachway to the right. That is a man-made breachway, and the sediment was dredged. If you can see my cursor adjacent to the degraded marsh, this is a higher elevation area, just adjacent to the breachway. So it was pumped in to the marsh area. These brownish areas are the die-off zones that you can see in the images to the right. A lot of shallow impounded water areas and marsh subsidence and vegetation die-off. So similar to other projects, this was a hydraulic dredge operation. They actually had 2 dredgers working because our dredge window is so limited. And this is an 8-inch pipe that this amphibious excavator moved around. and then they had bulldozers that graded to target elevations. And this is what we were left with in end of January 2017. You can see the bulldozer tracks along, where they were grading, and you can begin to see some depressions that are forming. And because it was sand, we didn't have an issue with the, we were able to walk out on site immediately, pretty much. So it dewatered fairly quickly, except along the lower edges where the water got trapped, and it was somewhat like quicksand. So the site isn't the easiest to access. It's at the end of a barrier spit. So you can either drive a four-wheel drive vehicle a walkable distance, or we're limited with what we could be doing and what equipment we could be getting out there right off the bat. I just got a message. My internet is unstable, so I'm going to turn off my video. I hope that helps. And the first thing we noticed was that sand stabilization was a must. We were out there a day where we had 45-mile-an-hour winds, and it was like a desert of sand blowing about 15 feet above the ground. And so instead of trying to bring dune fencing out, which would have been difficult to get out there, we have a local source of beach grass that we were able to get quickly, and we started planting in February. We also used dead wood that was from Hurricane Sandy, from the surge, brush, etc., that we used as makeshift windrows to capture the sand. And this image to the right, oops, it's not, I guess my arrow didn't work, is some piping plovers that are using, that actually seeking refuge in a small little piece of wood that is capturing sand. Adriana, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Have the video, turning your video off helped.
So my internet being unstable, I am not, just let me, I'm not able to move my cursor any longer.
We can see it moving when you're moving it around the mouse.
Okay, but I'm not able to move get to the next.
Oh, you're not advancing your slide.
No.
Yeah, so let me just turn off my video again. I might just try to reshare here.
Okay, no worries. I'll pull up the PDF from my email too if we need a nuclear option.
Hold on, let me just stop share and I'm gonna start again here. Let's see if this works. Sorry, you guys. I came home so I could focus, and that was probably a bad idea. So can you see the screen? Okay, there we go. There are piping plovers that Suzanne can talk about later that immediately found the large, what appears to be a washover zone by early March. And so we were working around piping plovers that were foraging in this area. So that was what I would refer to as adaptive management. We did not expect to have to manage sand, but we started managing sand quite quickly. Then we started restoring reestablishing the hydrology and the drainage. And I'm referring to this stage as still part of the construction phase, because you have to plan that placing the sediment is the first phase of construction, and then restoring hydrology is the second. So you can see in this upper left image the amount of impounded brackish water that's up along the upper edge of this marsh. And we were using our state's low ground pressure excavator through the mosquito abatement program, which is a great little tool, great for marshes. We could have probably been using a larger piece of machinery, but it would have been hard to get to this site. So it's good for digging, not necessarily the most efficient for grading. So this is this is like month 1 and 2 after placing the sediment. This is where the machine really wasn't the most useful tool, a very small excavator to grade places that in the upper picture, we were grading the sediment up to the upper edge where water was getting trapped. And then in the lower right picture is where we were grading, the contractor had graded this material to a certain elevation, but it traps water in the sediment and it wasn't draining out. So you
Hello?
get these sand conditions.
Hey, Steph, how you
And-
doing?
Someone might need to go on mute. And so grading it allows that water to drain off. So again, we were using the tools we had. To plan ahead, I would look for larger low ground pressure bulldozers to help with that final grading. So here in the image to the left is the areas that we graded. And then the image to the right are the creeks that we dug. The larger creeks are in red, and I'm referring to shallower creeks or runnels are in blue. And those we dug over, it probably was over from 2017 to 2018, we installed this drainage. We incorporated planting into year 1 and 2. And when I look at all these polygons, I'm amazed how much we did plant. The yellow is the Ammophila or beach grass, which again wasn't expected to be planted, but you can see the amount of planting we did to create windrows to capture the sand, as well as to create like a watershed divide. So we had separate tide sheds so we wouldn't end up with impounded water in the middle of these large areas of sediment placement. That did very well. The Alterniflora, which is in the bright lime green, did not do too well the first year, nor did some of the high marsh plants because of both hypersalinity in the soils as well as anoxic conditions. We didn't have any issues with pH at this site. But in the well-drained areas, you can see how well our Disticlus plugs did within 2 growing seasons. They had coalesced into a nice area of Disticlus, and you can see a couple years later, we're actually getting some Solidago. It was a little higher elevation than Disticlus. We actually have some Iva growing in there now. This is an image of some of the hypersaline areas where the Alterniflora wasn't making it. But if you notice, you'll see there's a little drainage feature here. And where you had drainage, the plants were doing well. Again, why it's better to wait to do planting until you've been able to restore the hydrology. What I'm referring to as phase 2 hydrology restoration is after that first growing season, we continued in the for another 2 years restoring hydrology. We worked with the EPA Atlantic Ecology Division doing some monitoring, and they were able to create this great salinity map. And they were actually, instead of just using pore water salinity with a refractometer, they were able to monitor the specific conductivity, and they could pick up these hot spots of salinity of over 45 to 60 parts per thousand. And these are right along the edge of the marsh where we had this vegetated marsh edge that acted as a sill. It acted as a sediment fence to hold the sediment in place when it was placed on the marsh, but then it actually impounded water and created these hypersaline conditions. So we dug drainage features through that peat, through the existing vegetation and up into the sediment placement area, and saw recolonization and lower salinity levels the next growing season. Now, getting into the maintenance phase, once we had created a variety of wider creeks and smaller secondary channels or runnels, we had to maintain them. And what we learned with a site with a lot of sand is that you have to maintain these until the site revegetates, because that sand is going to move both wind as well as rain events or larger tide events. So different ways that we accomplish that. We went back to our initial creeks and we started doing a lot of grading of the slopes to make them more dissipative slopes. A challenge there, we had done planting adjacent to these streams. Here you can see the goose fence in the background. And so all of a sudden we're trying to do grading and the plantings kind of getting in the way. And we had to move this material and grade it back into the marsh platform. So we actually did we transplanted some of our transplants to make space for the grading. Again, another reason to wait on the planting. Once we had those more dissipative slopes, we planted with Alterniflora to help stabilize the sand. And you can see how those creeks have started to grow in with the Alterniflora. In areas that we dug down into the existing peat to allow for drainage of the perched water table adjacent to the salt marsh, we removed some of the sand right from the peat adjacent to our creek, kind of a little sill. And because we did that before the first growing season, the vegetation hadn't died off, and we actually got a nice revegetated buffer from the existing peat. The plants were able to continue to grow, and they helped stabilize those smaller secondary channels. In areas that were higher elevation, you can see the dune grass in the background. Those dune grass areas actually built in elevation significantly because they trap sand. We did have these depressions up in the marsh platform where the sediment was placed, and they held fresh water during rain events when the water and also when the water table was high, and you could see some Phragmites shoots coming in. So this is where we did a lot of hand digging, and we didn't expect that these were going to be permanent features, but trying to allow that fresh water a path out to ensure that we didn't create conditions that were ideal for Phragmites to colonize. And you can see how they've revegetated. You can kind of pick out the drainage features, and they do help allow for a flow path during rain events. And on this map, you can see kind of the teal blue runnels. Those were all hand dug, and some of them tied in directly into our excavator dug runnels. Some just went right out to the existing creeks. So that was our maintenance phase, for maintenance and adaptive management phase for Ninigret, and which we still are in. We're still maintaining those features and doing a little bit of adaptive management with regards to identifying other areas that we might need to extend, for example, a runnel to drain some impounded water. One thing we did do at this site, which we didn't do at Quaney, we used deer fencing to create goose exclosures. A lot of work, a lot of effort to take them down long term. And the reality is you can't block off the whole, you can't fence off the whole marsh. The geese will come in, and especially at this time of year, they dig down and eat the roots of the Spartina. You can see them where they ate the Spartina we planted along the creek. You can see each of our little planting areas. So my thought there is that you just plan for it, and you ensure that it's something that's in your design plan, that it's a factor of doing any type of marsh restoration. Another thing we did was we planned for higher elevation areas. This is during a 2-foot storm tide that was about 2 feet higher than our existing tide events. And you can see some of the beach grass areas are the only areas where there isn't flooding. So we were planning a mosaic of habitat types with some higher elevation areas for marsh migration. And this was just taken a couple days ago at Quaney during about another 2 foot higher than our regular tides. And you can actually see the outline of the sediment placement area. Most of it's flooded, and there's just a the upper sections that are not flooded. And so for project timeline, just to give you a sense of, for the Ninigret project, really the first 2 years we were restoring hydrology. For this site, it took, or actually 2.5 years. It took about 2.5 years with the equipment we had, and additional grading. And now year 3, we're entering year 7. Year 3 through 6, I would say that was more where we were maintaining what we had done. Again, we had done planting in the spring 1 and 2. I would suggest that we hold off on that for other projects, and we didn't do that extensive planting at Quaney. I see Adriana, so I'm going to really quickly go through Quaney. This is just the next salt pond over. This man-made breachway went right through the salt marsh. It used to be, this marsh used to connect together. So this has been a highly impacted marsh. This is where the sediment was excavated from, in the salt pond, this channel and this channel here. It was placed both on the east and west side of the breachway. And you can see in year 1 some of the drainage features we started to install and some dune fencing. And here it is 4 years out, when you begin to see some revegetation. So similarly, we did a lot of grading out at the site. We did some, this area that you see in the foreground, that you would have sunk, almost knee deep in that material. That's where the water gets trapped in the sediment, and by grading it out, you get that water that's trapped in that fine sediment, or it's the sand. Even though it's sand, it still traps water to drain out. And then we started doing the grading. We did proactive sand stabilization. We installed a dune fence to create individual tide sheds proactively. And you can see with very little planting how much vegetation's come back. This site had even more issues with windblown sand. Year 2 and 3. These are drainage features that we dug that were filled with fine sand after the first and second winters. This is Spartina alterniflora that looks like a sand dune. Any structure catches the fine sand. And this is actually Salicornia that was in a depression of one of our drainage channels. The seeds flowed into the drainage channel. The vegetation grew one season. That winter, the Salicornia actually acted as enough structure to capture sand. So we actually have a little ridge of Salicornia there. So the sand is going to move. One way to maintain sand, to prevent it from going into our creeks, we use the peat that we excavate when we're digging our creeks and runnels to act as somewhat like check dams or sills. And you can see the revegetation of these little chunks of peat, which help, sorry about that, which help stabilize those creeks. We also tied into existing elevation at this site versus we ensured that the sediment, we weren't getting impounded water up along the upper edge, as well as we provide drainage for brackish marshes adjacent to the salt marsh. And we provided drainage from the sediment placement into the lower elevation marsh adjacent to the sediment placement area. And instead of planting, we did some planting here, but we allowed for a lot of colonization by the existing seed source. This is at one of our creeks. This is mainly Salicornia and Sueda. Just to see the amount of seeds that gather in those creeks just from the tide flowing in and out. That all came in on its own, as well as we have these, the upper edge of the marsh where the rack deposits is where we got the most revegetation. And this is an image from this fall of an area. All the vegetation you see in the foreground was just from rack that washed in. And here's some images before and a couple growing seasons, 2 or 3 growing seasons later for Quaney, Salt Pond, Ninigret, and can see some of the frag in the foreground at Ninigret. That's expected at the elevations that we have out there. There's IVA in the foreground. The monitoring that we did, to Bart's point, most of the adaptive management hydrology restoration was based upon qualitative observational monitoring, but we have a robust monitoring. We've been monitoring a suite of parameters at both sites, and I put in the chat, Kenny Raposa, my colleague from the Estuarine Research Reserve, just got published a paper laying it on thick. He certainly got the message on not using TLP and ecosystem effects of sediment placement. And it highlights the first 4 years of monitoring data from the Ninigret site. And then my last slide is just, here's an idealized timeline, is plan for, especially if you're dealing with beach sand, plan for sand management year 1 after sediment placement. And when I say year 1, I'm talking about month 1 through 4, immediately after placement. Plan for hydrology restoration and grading year 1 and 2. And possibly year 2, start to think about salt marsh planting along the drainage features. And then ideally by year 3, you've gotten that hydrology restored or reestablished, and now you can get into that more of that maintenance phase. And at that point, you could assess possibly additional planting needs. And for us, we were able to secure extra funding for our time to do this through a state fund. But as Bart suggested, that's key in your initial planning, who's going to do this work, because it is a key component of these sediment place elevation enhancement projects. Is you have to restore hydrology, and you have to plan for the time and energy and effort it takes. And we couldn't have done this without all of our local and state partners, as well as our federal partners. Suzanne Payton, being a little state, we all know each other, which is great. And our kids have grown up on these projects, to say the least, together. Also, we could not have physically done this without probably thousands of hours of volunteer and intern help. So the real cost of adaptive management on this site, I really don't know. I haven't figured that out with all the volunteer and intern help that we have had, but something to certainly plan for in future projects.
Thank you so much, Wenli. The tall order to ask someone to present 2 simultaneous projects and hit the adaptive management and maintenance phase. I think it's really important to have the context for what those projects are, and then, you know, what the ongoing process and the tweaks are. So I really appreciate you providing that really helpful background in those examples. It's certainly an impressive body of work for sure. At this point, a little later than expected, but still in earnest, we're going to shift gears to our moderated panel discussion. So I'll ask Bart, Suzanne, and Lisa to all come on camera for me. And we wanted to focus, that's a ton of information. Changing questions as we go. So I really appreciate the introduction and those examples. So this is a beast, right? So figuring out what to do post-construction, how do we get from, you know, the planned and permitted activity to the function and meeting the restoration goals that we had all set forward. So before I get on that soapbox and kick us off too hard, I want to actually officially introduce or invite our panelists to introduce themselves. We've already heard from Bart and Wenli, but Suzanne, can you introduce yourself for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Payton. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our Southern New England Coastal Program Office, which incorporates portions of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Long Island, New York. And yes, I've been with our coastal program for the last, almost 12 years. And before that was with our refuge program.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And then Lisa, our Coastal New Jersey panelist today. Thanks for holding down the fort, Lisa.
Right. Thanks for having me on, and thanks everyone. Nice to be here. I'm Lisa Ferguson. I'm at the Wetlands Institute in Southern New Jersey, and have been involved in the 7 Mile Island Innovation Lab projects since those kicked off in 2014, and have been here in this position for 10 years, working on related projects and monitoring.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for being here too. I do want to acknowledge in the chat, just before we completely shift gears, while Kwani and Ninigret are fresh on our minds, Wenli, there was, Lenore had a question for you in the chat about the grain size of your stand and what the breakdown was, just so we can line those up with our experiences.
Hey, Bart, you want to answer that as the geomorphologist? It was fine beach sand. I don't know what the grain size was off the top of my head.
Yeah, neither do I. I don't know the fee size or whatever. Yeah, I would concur with Wenli. It was fine grain sand. It was blowing readily. And
And
it wasn't even like at a massive storm event. It was just a strong wind and it was moving around. So
and
Thank
low
you.
organic content.
Yeah, it looked
But-
really
But I
light.
don't know the proportions. I mean, I guess we could try to find it in our files.
But mostly clean, fine sand is the. Okay. Thanks, guys. All right, so I wanted to kick us off with maybe an easy one, although this is always our challenge, right? To provide a lot of examples and then find the synergy between them. So I heard described a variety of different adaptive management or maintenance strategies, some in the hydrology family, some in vegetation management, some in sediment grading, and just kind of those adjusting and those tweaks. And so I guess the question I'm trying to form is, I'm just going to ask you guys to go around the horn and identify which of those strategies you have experience with. And then if you could also say whether you anticipated the need for that kind of management or not, just to try to frame us. Bart, you want to kick us off? Pick a project, not all like 12.
okay. No, I mean, I'll let everyone kind of do, like, because everyone's tired of hearing from me probably, but I will say, like, most projects you go into, you think you're going to do something, you just don't know what it is. So it's like, again, like for, certain aspects, especially the hydrology piece is the one that always to me is like, if you get that wrong, everything else cascades out of control. And that's the one for like an adaptive management piece. I just really hyper focus on really making sure we get that one right. So.
Great. Thank you. Or Suzanne,
so
go ahead.
I guess I'll just say, right, they're obviously all interrelated, but I guess from my experience, I'll say, when I was involved in the first project, we sort of envisioned you spend a lot of time on your design. You spend a lot of time thinking about your target elevations. You quantify, what your sediment looks like. You think about the amount of channels that you need for your tide sheds for, to get the hydrology right. And you think about your target elevations for planting and then after, what you all just heard from Wenli, you go, oh, okay. Or maybe we shift and we do this, but I'll agree from what Bart and Wenli both said. I think the hydrology ends up being a really critical piece and it takes a long time to just stay with it, to get it right. And the grants that we were working off of, at least, are like Bart described, they want you to have completed the project in 2 years. And I don't think that that's possible. That what we're explaining or what we are learning is that, as people probably all know, these aren't things that you just go out once and implement and walk away. If you want a functioning system, you have to stay with it until you get to that point. And so, yeah, I would say, starting from the very beginning to either get that that next grant that will fund the adaptive management. Or in Rhode Island, we were really fortunate, and also in Connecticut, to start early and engage with academic partners as well as the estuarine research reserves to get queued up in advance to be ready to be able to do the post-restoration monitoring that would inform any sort of adaptive management. But I guess your question really was more about, so the plant sites feel like, I personally like being able to jumpstart, because I'm trying to get the restoration to advance more quickly, which then in turn prevents the sediment from moving around and that sort of thing too. But that's a fine balance, like Wenli said, with not wanting to have to undo something you've invested in if things shift. So I would say that the hydrology is number one, but also we've been doing some research on soil amendments. When you have systems where, you know, you're concerned about that, I think testing the soil and understanding what soil you've got, especially if you're not just doing a very thin application, that's critical. And we are doing some research at the University of Connecticut. We're funding some research to evaluate the potential for soil amendments to ensure successful projects.
That's really great. Thank you, Suzanne. Lisa, can I kick it over to you since we've heard and seen Wenli's?
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, I would say some of the earlier projects that I was involved in that and that we did the beneficial use projects, there was maybe not as much adaptive management that was anticipated, and so that was like, you know, the learning process as it went. But then developing out more projects through the SMIL area, that then became kind of anticipated, and you know what the trajectory of the project would be, what the needs would be, and what monitoring just immediately after the fact and ongoing would be needed, and more investment like the site, pre-site, understanding what's there, and you know, setting those metrics for what the goals are after the fact, for construction, but also monitoring, so you can track to that. So for sure, I think the presentations I really enjoyed today, and those are all like thematic and relevant to the projects and what we've been involved in this area. And understanding the hydrology, tracking the vegetation regrowth, where it's working, where it's not, where it's coming back naturally, and the seed banks, and then where it's not, the ponding of water, and then what can kind of help to remediate those areas as possible. And sometimes need to go back to hit elevation targets and consider, you know, what's involved in the construction process for that, to be able to still make progress towards the initial objectives of the project.
Great. Thank you so much. So Wenli, not to exclude you, your thoughts on this one?
I have to say, I wasn't listening to the question because I was looking up that question for Lenore. So which one was more important? Or
No, essentially just, I think we have a sense of the types of adaptive management techniques, right? So you mentioned plantings and structural kind of stabilization. So I would say,
yeah.
how much did you anticipate versus was a surprise? Maybe think about your first project versus your more recent.
Because we were doing hydrology restoration in salt marshes, using runnels and selective ditch maintenance to address this legacy impacts to marshes from agricultural and mosquito control activities, I think about drainage all the time. That's kind of where our focus is. And so we had already done some drainage enhancement prior to the Ninigrit project to stabilize some of the unconsolidated sediment that was out there in some of those large impounded water areas. So we were planning it. I had no idea it was going to take that much work. It was a huge amount of work. The grading was significant. I think that's something where we could have better, you know, in future projects plan for, okay, we're going to need a bigger piece of machine to come in and grade to get those final grades, because the contractor's doing what they're, told. You get to the target elevation, or there's some areas that are higher elevation with excess material. It's been agreed upon by the project partners, but they can only grade so much, and it's not grading for drainage, it's grading for elevation. And I think that's something we could plan for future projects, making sure we have the appropriate tools on site. And you need to be doing that in concert with restoring the hydrology,
Great.
or creating the creeks to restore hydrology.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. I got distracted. I was reading the questions in the chat, which are fantastic questions. So I'll make sure, maybe I'll throw you guys one more, and then we'll pepper in the audience questions as well. So I guess as you were describing, right? So we knew we'd have to do something. We even knew it was going to be in this realm. We didn't know how much or for how long or with which equipment. Are there features of a contract or of a permitting process that give you that latitude or constrain you in a way? We've heard about the funding constraint, but as we're thinking about managing expectations, right, all the way across the board, how do we let "I don't know yet, but I'll tell you when I do" be an okay answer? Sorry, that felt really leading as a question, but I'd love to hear your guys' reaction to kind of that. How do we bring regulators along and be allowed to do this in a streamlined?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that, because you kind of mentioned that, how do you kind of like integrate this into kind of like the idea of like a contractor doing it? And then how do you kind of permit it? And I think that's where
You caught that, huh?
yeah,
Separate
no
those
one
two
like
questions. Answer
yeah,
them.
I mean, but it kind of brings up that idea of like a permitting perspective. Like, I understand that like regulators, you want like, again, we're being required to put in adaptive management plans, which is great. Like to talk about like, we're not just going to let the site, fade away. What's kind of our plan? But I think that kind of is like that leading thing where it's like, you want to be realistic in that, but some people want to see like all these decisions is being made with all this rigor. But a lot of times, it's like Wendy was saying, it's not. And to that end, I think that's where, some of that is that open conversation to say, we're going to be out there a lot looking at the site. Can we have a longer window for our permitting, that allows us to kind of do this work and be more kind of prescriptive, hands-on. One of the problems is if like from a regulatory perspective, there's a lapse in like your permit and you have to go reapply for another permit for adaptive management. These lapses, aren't allowing you to kind of go out there and tweak and tweak and tweak, versus 3 years later, you have to go in and do like wholesale, like redoing things, and I think that's where I don't know what the answer is, because I think it's the idea of like, well, what about maintenance? Is maintenance included? Am I reapplying for permits on maintenance, which, sometimes that's an easy thing, sometimes it's not. And I think that's where, again, those honest conversations with the regulators so they understand like, yes, I'm submitting this adaptive management plan, but please realize that a lot of it may be predicated on, you go out there and you're like, oh crap, all the water is backed up against this area. It's just sitting there ponding. It's going to start breeding mosquitoes this summer. Okay, what do we do? And I think that's where, again, with some of this, I always think of typical sections. This is what we're going to do. We don't know where the layout of the channel is, but typically we're going to go in and use this mini X could do this, or we're going to use a rotary ditcher to do this. Once I'm done, I will give you the final layout map. But right now, I can't give that to you.
Helpful. Lisa, I saw you nodding along. I know that there's been a lot of evolution within the 7 Mile Innovation Lab, thinking about the right kinds of things to be looking at. And so I'm just wondering if, and I know it's an Army Corps project, so maybe you don't have the regulatory constraint, but are there lessons learned in that adaptive management process that might help others as they're kind of creating those pathways or building it into their permits or managing those expectations?
Well, just the value of being out there and having eyes on and the familiarity throughout the course of it, not just, the less frequent check-ins. It really just does make a difference in the value of being able to make those smaller courses of action rather than, let things be and then go back and do something else at a large scale. Being able to adjust is, I think, just really key. They definitely aren't build and let go projects. So the monitoring is just so important for, making the successful outcomes and ensuring them the best that can be done. So the regulatory side of that, finding opportunity for the time to allow that, extending that time and flexibility to the extent possible to open up those kind of unanticipated needs or those kind of challenges that occur after the fact, which can be mitigated, but need some intervention to help things move along.
Thank you. So what frequency would you say you guys have eyes on? I know you're out there all the time, which is wonderful. There's a lot of work going on out there, but for someone that isn't in a living laboratory situation, do you have a sense of what you'd recommend as a minimum, seasonally, annually?
I mean, I think we're lucky to check in, big storm events can really change things. And so we're lucky with the proximity that we can check in. And I think we learn a lot, and sometimes things, those are the important times and the critical times to be aware of what just happened. And so that can then adjust plans coming ahead for seasonal work or monitoring. So yeah, I think we're trying to get out. I mean, we're lucky to get out throughout the year, probably monthly, quarterly, to check on these sites and to visit them. That's not going to be practical or even reasonable in all cases, but I think different times throughout the annual cycle, when the forces, whatever that, it's going to be site specific, what, forces might be most impactful, but kind of understanding and adjusting those visits for those times to be able to kind of see what the impacts are, especially with, those, the hydrology, the ponding, issues like that, to understand where you're running into factors that need to be addressed.
That's a really excellent point about knowing which forces are driving the changes you're seeing in the site, and then building your site visits, your reactive site visits around that. So if you have a wind-driven sand site, big blows are, you want to go check at least for the first couple of years, or if you have ponded water after those king tides, those kinds of things. So I think that's a really excellent point of, if you can't be out there all the time, know which events you expect to be causing those big shifts and build that into your initial observations.
But I'll also add that I think, technology has allowed us that if you can't be out there all the time, game cameras are a great way to collect data time series of areas of concern. So you can actually look at the tidal cycle through an area and look at how water's moving. Also, if you're a little bit more concerned, some of the game cameras that are cell phone enabled, again, sometimes it's worth investment. So you can real time look at sites or do things like that, which can be pretty amazing, tool for if you have serious concerns or it's really hard to get out to, it costs a little bit of money, but again, that investment may help give, a bigger bang for your buck when you get out there and you download the camera or whatever. So
I think that's a great idea, and especially those first couple years. Just like the other day, literally Monday, while I'm working on this presentation, I get in my inbox drone imagery from a volunteer. And there's another option where they don't have all the restrictions that I have using a drone. They can go out and gather. I'm not asking any questions of how they're getting their drone imagery, but they're getting a lot of drone imagery. And I wouldn't have known about this big storm tide that we just had, and the effects on the Quaney Marsh. And I think, as Lisa, you said, the going out at different seasons, especially those first few years. Again, if you don't visit the site, sometime in the winter, late winter, to understand sand movement, storm damage, you might have missed a whole chapter of this restoration process. And And I think that's an important thing that you want to incorporate into your first. I was about to try to take winter off my timeline, and then I thought, no, we really did go out in the winter, and it was important to go out those first few winters. Now I'm not going out now in the winter to do work, but we're in that more of the maintenance phase.
Anything else to add on the regulatory frequency of site visit, ways to keep an eye on the site? Go ahead, Susan.
No, I was gonna say, I would defer to Wenley on the frequency of having to get maintenance permits and that sort of thing, because I know she's taken the lead on trying to maintain all of that permitting. But from, you know, we did talk in advance. I was doing more of the federal compliance work in advance of the project. So the, you know, environmental assessments and the NEPA work and the all of that, Section 7. So we did anticipate that we might get plovers colonizing the site because it's a back barrier system and there are plovers nesting on the beachfront. And I've had other projects where we had rare plants that we were concerned about, or terrapin or other state listed species. And at this at the Quaney site, it was a really big horseshoe crab spawning area. And so whether it's permit related or otherwise, I mean, from a wildlife perspective, there are different times of year where we wanted to be out there to see what was happening and just to document that and to figure out if there were issues. We had horseshoe crabs that were, you know, sort of confused and spending quite a bit of time up on the flat area where the sand was deposited. That Wenley's volunteers and others helped direct back to the water once they were done laying their eggs. So there were a lot of other sort of things that I think we didn't really anticipate, but that's not specifically about a permitting issue. That was just about how frequently you're visiting the site. And I think early on it's important more often, but knowing your site and knowing what your resource issues are might drive some of that.
And to Suzanne and her colleagues at the refuge were, Suzanne was a partner on the project, but then you were able to get me in touch with the appropriate refuge biologist when we saw piping plovers on site. And instead of saying, okay, project shut down, and here we are in March, and we've done pretty much nothing out there because we've only been out there for a few weeks. We had a system in place where I would be documenting, okay, the piping plovers are here, and they were saying what behaviors to look out for, and they were also monitoring, but there was a dialogue back and forth to make sure that we weren't going to cause any impact, and then notifying us like, oh, we just found a scrape over here, so they might begin nesting, and once they started nesting, we shut down the work. But that gave us more than 2 full months of time to work in the spring when the piping plovers were there. And just on the permitting side, our dredge permits were long. So I had to go back to the Corps for some of this hydrology restoration, something I've been doing in some of the tidal hydrology work in marshes, just in general. I'm now asking for a 10-year permit because we expect to be doing ongoing maintenance, and we know we do those projects in phases as well. And I've just started to get some 10-year permits, and I think that could be something that we look at. That there's the dredging, which might have some different stipulations and criteria, but for that active management, I think a 10-year permit would be ideal.
Thank you so much, Wenley. I think on the thread of permitting, and I think linking a little bit to Danielle's question in the chat, possibly, I'll ask this and then we'll kick to hers. So I think there's a range of activities, right? So runnels and shovels and versus excavators versus additional sediment. There's this range of activities. Is there a threshold that you encountered or a reason to stay below a certain threshold that would have been triggered? Now we need a permit amendment, or now we need to do X, Y, and Z, or do you felt like you were maybe empowered to do what needed done and work closely with regulators to get it done?
I mean, I'll say for a lot of the projects we've done that the bigger the project, I think at times you think it wouldn't be this way, but you get greater leeway because again, it's just, I feel like the bigger projects, it's a bigger scale, there's a bigger scope, and there's a little bit more leeway with like, yeah, you can do that, that's fine. Or like, you talk to your regulators and they say, okay, great. Sometimes some of the smaller projects is where we've had some of the biggest pushback of, bringing up this idea of hydrology restoration and, talking about, well, we were thinking about trying to bring, something out on the marsh to do this again, tracked piece of low PSI equipment. And that's where we've gotten some of the greatest pushback. And we've been kind of forced to maybe do something that's maybe not as ideal or try to look at new means to do it. And that's where some of the idea of the Marsh Master with the cutter head that was used at Reed's Beach, even though that was just a hydrology restoration, some of that came out as an effective tool that wouldn't be as impacted on the marsh as other means. And it was actually an easier way to kind of facilitate that work. So sometimes working with your regulators to kind of come out of the box thinking can also help, but it is, again, bigger projects. There's bigger leeway, but I think that's inherently part of it but again, also I think with one of the points I made earlier on, the discussion of like your footprint and how you're discussing them, again, if you're putting forth that the hydrology is going to look like this after I'm done, I think you're setting yourself up to be kind of like modifying versus I'm going to restore a natural hydrology. It's going to kind of look like this. They're going to be kind of this wide, this deep, a rough network would probably extend over the area. If you maybe go that model, then maybe it's easier to kind of implement that.
Thanks, Bart. So Danielle's specific question, I think you guys have all had a chance to read it, is which hydrologic restoration for channels and runnels and things created post-sediment placement were designed or planned using qualitative observations, and which needed that quantitative? So like a DEM or an as-built if you were going to make a hydrologic restoration. So I think understanding what was asked so that we can have an informed conversation about what could be more reasonable in the future. Danielle, did I characterize that correctly?
Yes, and I think you touched on it a little bit about thresholds, like maybe I'll just hear what they have to say.
So Danielle, for ours, we had survey done post placement, and then we had survey done, some of our restoration partners through URI did survey, but we use qualitative as an observational monitoring to develop the drainage plan. For the Quaney Marsh, there was some indication. We had we put on the plan, there will be some hydrology restoration, somewhat like this. But for Ninigret, we basically implemented that without any plans in place, based upon just looking at the area where the impounded water was. And again, it was a combination of needing to do more grading as well as installation of creeks. At Quaney, we didn't have to do as much work because the design was, we tied into the upland edge more. So we had a lot more issues at Ninigret where we were, the goal was not to allow have these areas go right up to the existing edge, because then the Phragmites could extend out. But it ended up that, well, you just end up creating an impoundment if you don't provide a path for that groundwater off the marsh platform. So, it was very observational monitoring based that in how we came up with the restoration or plan for hydrology.
I was just going to say, I suspect that it varies from state to state with regard to what the regulatory agencies and require. And in Rhode Island, we're fortunate that, you know, it can be as Wenley just described, but I'm not familiar with what might be required in other states.
That's an excellent point, Suzanne. And I think one of the things that we come up against a lot in here of, well, in New Jersey, this is what we're doing. But I think the more we can bring these kinds of case studies and examples, successful examples, to the forefront and discuss them across state lines, the more likely we are to have a larger body of work to have informed discussions. So, and I think to the early adopters, the folks that have been doing these projects so far, we have a lot of trust and good relationships with regulators. And so what I think about a lot in kind of the next phase of, or next cohort of projects, is how do we capture, that's one of the tasks of this learning network, is to coalesce what we know so that there's a body of work and evidence, and then eventually be able to transfer some of our expertise and trust to a wider audience, because we're all going to, you know, these projects, what we're hearing is 10 years of maintaining them and carefully tending them to make sure that they end up to be their best selves when they grow up, and then hope that at that point they don't need more sediment. You know, I think more of us need to be doing these projects down the road. And so I think that's why it's important to understand kind of what our shared experiences are here. But I know it's a hope of Wenley is that we start to get our regulatory communities together and let them see each other as a resource for this.
Adriana, can I just
Please.
ask the other panelists one quick question? Has anyone used quantitative information to plan their hydrology improvements after placement? No, so it's pretty qualitative for all of these projects, and that's something we need to discuss with regulators. And I ask because that's really important as we start planning projects. Do we need to have funding to go back and do, you know, a lot of post-placement data collection, or maybe spend more money on staff time doing these observations in the field? So thank you guys.
Yeah, and I can share one example and, oh, go ahead, Bart.
I mean, I was just going to say, like, I think Danielle brings up a great point for monitoring. There's monitoring for adaptive management, and then there's monitoring for performance of your site. And I think they're not necessarily the same. They can overlap, but they're not necessarily the same. And I think that's a really good distinction, that, you know, our long-term monitoring for performance of a methodology, a technique, you know, we're collecting it for 3-5 years. At the end, we analyze the data. That's not necessarily going to give us what we need for adaptive management. So Danielle, you're right. Like, you may be collecting that, but then also just going out there and pointing and looking. And I said, the most qualitative thing I did for a lot of our adaptive management, like at Prime Hook, was taking aerial photography, taking satellite photography that I requested from like a couple weeks before, trying to use that to kind of map out my areas and come up with some overview kind of watersheds, kind of tide sheds of like, okay, here's a distinct area, here's a distinct area. So when I went out there, I kind of knew what I was looking at. But beyond that, it was like, once you hit the ground, then you're kind of like, oh, here's the low spot. Let's connect the low spots. Here's a berm. Let's knock through that, you know, so.
That's really interesting. And I love when you started this talking about adaptive management versus site maintenance. And that piece fits into that also, because I think adaptive management is working on this site to accomplish goals. And that means planning hydrology. And so we need to know what data collection is needed to plan hydrology. And then I think site maintenance is maintaining after you reach your overall project goals.
We were very intentional about splitting adaptive management and observational triggers, I guess, the types of things we're sensing on the site and reacting to in this adaptive management time. And a quick plug for our next webinar, which will be focused on evaluating performance and through a more intensive monitoring program. But I think in a perfect world, you're spending a ton of time and energy doing this monitoring program. So if there are pieces that can crosswalk, especially the stuff that you can get a quicker turnaround on, I think photo points are one thing that we used a lot that's part of our rigorous monitoring program at Avalon and Fortescue. we refer to those photos a lot, but it's nice to have that full sequence. But when you're starting to see signals on the ground, that we used those photo points a lot in conversations about these adjustments and tweaks to be able to say, okay, so this isn't recovering. And then to start to go down that road and bring the rest of your project team along, because you've got one person out there that notices something. How do you capture that information to bring it to the rest of the team? And then how do you communicate that out to the people that need to give you permission, and things like that. So trying to think about what observations, we just do a quick round robin of what types of observational, what are we noticing, and can those things be taught or transferred to trigger management?
I was going to share an example from Connecticut where just that was specific to adaptive management. And so we had invited the regulatory agencies to sit on the project teams. And so when something is observed on the site post-restoration, called a project meeting and had the conversation. Like, this was not in our permit. This is something we didn't anticipate. Is everyone okay with this? Do you need us to submit anything? And make sure that we had everything we needed, at least verbally, before we move forward. But so we had one example where we had a portion of a restoration site where we did some sediment placement, but had not anticipated that we would need to do any hydrological monitoring. We had other portions where we had designed channels and the hydrology. But on this site, we had not anticipated that we would need to do any of that. But during construction, there was compaction in areas we didn't anticipate they were going to drive back and forth over the exact same location. But the way the contractor ended up doing it, they literally, they had set down mats and everywhere else. But in this specific area, it was a low impact area. We thought they would be reaching in and placing material and not driving on the site, but they had to in order to complete the project. And so we had water pooling in compacted areas. And so we wanted to be able to put some small runnels in just to ensure proper drainage and not have, a vegetative loss in compacted areas. So we were all really disappointed to see it, but we immediately talked to, the regulatory folks, and they said that felt like it was just kind of a follow-up to make sure that we didn't do any harm through the process of the restoration project. So we were able to immediately talk to our mosquito abatement person. They came in and used their low ground pressure equipment to create a small runnel, and that was great. The other example I have is something else we hadn't anticipated that we haven't yet figured out how to address. Was on Christmas Day this year, we had a huge storm here in the Northeast with, 50 to 60 mile an hour winds coming off the coast, and during the high tide, moved a significant amount of rack up onto the project site. And we now have like really deep, massive sections of our restoration site that are covered with rack, including some of the planted areas where our plants are completely underneath, and we're trying to assess whether or not we think the plants will grow through it, or if we literally should go out and rake it off or mulch it up, or let's observe and see what happens. Expect that we're going to have a die-off area or hope that it brings in a lot of nice seed. And so we're all like, I don't know. So if anyone has any great experience they'd love to share, I'd be happy to hear it. But that, I think, is an opportunity for adaptive management. We're talking about implementing, doing it sort of in a research sort of fashion, and actively managing some of it and leaving other sections. There's enough of it to sort of experimentally take some different approaches. But if anyone has recommendations, that would be great. But that's not certainly, we don't think we need permitting to do that, but it's an adaptive management that's going to take a lot of people and manpower.
Roving piles of rock, that's near and dear to my heart. That is the story of Ring Island, among other things, the constant source of disruption there, or disturbance there. Any other thoughts on this? I see Ben has his hand up, and I'm not sure if he's gonna ask a question or contribute, because I know he's part of the team.
I say to Suzanne, sorry, Ben, just to interrupt,
go for it.
that approach having the regulators like upfront. We know there will be adaptive and again, it's part of implementation, restoring hydrology. So we're restoring hydrology adaptively to what the site needs. And we're using observational monitoring. I think Bart's idea of the game cameras, because that, after large rain events for these higher elevation sites, where the water sits, that's another key component. So that's some real good data that could be helpful. But I love that idea of having, we definitely had site visits with the permitters, but they weren't necessarily part of the project team. And that could be a really nice model, Suzanne, so that you're engaging them. So when you are making these changes, and we can definitely plan in future permits that there will be hydrology restoration and it will look somewhat like this, and it will include this type of equipment, et cetera. That could all be it can be spelled out, but then they're the unknowns. And then, oh, well, we didn't expect the compaction because the contractor did it this way, or we didn't expect more material because the contractor did it that way. And good to have them on board right up front and part of the decision-making process. Sorry, Ben.
Oh, no, that was great. No, this might just be stating the obvious, but I was just kind of thinking about, when you're making those either vegetation where you're going to plant or those drainage decisions based on observational data. Sometimes I feel like I have the best insights on those horrible tide days where like I got to get something done and like I'll end up staying too long at the site and I'm getting flooded out. And I'm like, oh, that's exactly why the vegetation isn't growing there. Like looking where the rack lines are. You're out there trying to get stuff done so frequently, you really see where those rack lines are. And like, that's why I set the planting tray. But no, it's just something that came to mind. I can stall water loggers all day and know, right, relative, but when I go out there, it's usually what I'm seeing or where the water's getting trapped. I always plan field work around low tide, but I feel like the high tide days, you get another little piece of the puzzle. So
That's a fantastic point, Ben. Thanks for raising
no
that.
problem.
And Ben, the other thing that you used in we did at Quanti and Ninigrid as well, and we had the luxury of EPA's soil maps, soil salinity maps, but just using a sipper stick and a refractometer. Sometimes they're hard to use in sand, but you still can use your refractometer to get a sense, what that also helps identify the source of the water. And I know you've done soil salinity monitoring over on the Narrow, and that's been a helpful assessment tool.
No, agreed. I think the spot mapping, I think we can talk about this another time too. The EMI induction mapping, I thought was pretty fascinating when I went out this summer with the EPA folks, because it's shooting a meter below you, some of the hypersaline areas it wasn't even detecting. So I think some of what you maybe were seeing on your Ninigrid map might be in some cases a best case scenario. I think some of the challenge of getting a pore water sample 15 centimeters down in dry sediment, I feel like, anyways, I helped calibrate. I think they took 130 samples and helped calibrate taking 30 pore waters, and there was a variation. So it's kind of some interesting things. Be fun to talk about another time. But yeah, the sediment placement when it's thinner, I think the EMI goes right through it. So.
Adriana, one of the questions talking about kind of the kind of passive placement and letting the tide carry it. I was going to kind of interject on that when you're ready to kind of transition over. So I saw your comment.
Yes. Yeah, I think we can go there now. I think if there are other pieces of observational information, I think we heard photos, we heard go out on high tide days, go out after storm events. I'm just going to ask the others to mull on that. And ask you guys for your top last recommendation as we close out, but go nuts, Bart, in the meantime.
Oh no. So yeah, I mean, most of the projects we've been talking about are very prescriptive placement, but there are projects that we've done kind of trying to use the tide. Pepper Creek back in 2013 and something. That's one of the things we did. We were spraying from barges in the creek, so we could only get so far. So spraying at high tide, allowing that sediment to kind of move further into the marsh and use the existing channel network to move that sediment further in was one of the approaches we were taking, and it was good. You know, we did get a lot of passive accumulation in areas that wasn't directly sprayed. And even in Prime Hook, we did a bit of that where, you know, we were pumping material in a location that recovering the sand out of it and letting the mud go into the tide and flowing into the greater basin so that material could go wherever it wanted. So I think there are examples of that, you know, and I think even back to 2008, we did a project with the Army Corps where they were interested in just putting the sand at Mississippi Inlet for horseshoe crabs, but I wanted to keep the mud in the system. And again, it was that idea of, you know, open disposal on a beach face, you create a berm, you pump into a basin, and you can let the mud flow off and stay in the system, or divert that into like an area. So I think there are good examples of that, but it is something that would be, I think there's a lot of opportunities to do more of that, especially in areas where you have an existing hydrology you can utilize. But I think one of the problems we're seeing is that there's so many areas that there's a disconnect between the hydrology because of anthropogenic alteration. So a lot of times sediment, you know, we may be doing sediment sampling in an adjacent creek, but that sediment isn't necessarily reaching the marsh surface because of kind of like the ditching and different things like that. So I think it's that idea of like passive kind of, you know, mud motors, that type of thing, sand engines. You know, I think it's a good idea, but also depending on how you're trying to do it, you know, you kind of have to have a good understanding of that, because some of these areas, the hydrology is so messed up to begin with that you may not get the response you were looking for.
Thanks, Bart. I think, yeah, those are really great points. And I just, because today's examples were place the sand, grade the sand, I think, which is one of the reasons we wanted to bring the Rhode Island examples in. I think that there's a bunch of different models for getting these types of projects done, and there's more I won't even say more adaptive management associated with that. I think it's just different. So with, you know, silty sediments, you need to contain it to keep it on site. When we won't go down the containment hole today, but it comes with its own challenges. Some of the we've shared through the network before, some of the challenges at Avalon were related to containment. You know, it's kind of this double-edged sword. We kept it on site, but then we messed up the hydrology. So then we had to remove it, and that was expensive and unplanned and those kinds of things. See, I just went down like just a little bit, you know, we'll come back up. So I think that really just we're causing a disturbance, right, at this site, be it thick or thin placement, be it hydro first and then sand, or sand and then hydro. These sites need time to stabilize, and we need to be watching as that's happening. And so whatever that list of observational information or the frequency at which we're going out to be good stewards of these restoration sites is, I think, one of the biggest themes on this in this post-construction period, right? It's really, you know, your grant money has run out, you're starting another project, but don't forget about, you know, the site, or I guess, as we think about transitioning for a way, you know, into this phase, and then, you know, who is maintaining these sites? How do we prepare them with what resources is, I guess, one of the last things I wanted to allow everyone to kind of provide comments on. I think I heard Bart say earlier, it's the landowner, and sometimes that works if it's a refuge, or, you know, as we start to think about more of these projects getting done on a wider variety of places, how do we build that stewardship expectation in without scaring people?
That is a great question. And I think if I was a regulator, I'd be asking that question more than a prescriptive adaptive management plan, because it's who's going to be doing the work 5 years from now at this site.
Yep.
And I think with, you know, again, Rhode Island, we're this dinky little state, and we have been partnering together. This was on state land, but we were with DEM land, but it was a different state agency that was the lead. But I think putting that up front and acknowledging that there will be adaptive management, and there will be implementation to restore hydrology. Then there's going to be some adaptive management and maintenance. And maybe, as Ben pointed out, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they had a second contractor come in to do some a fine-tuned grading. And maybe that's when you could have a contractor with oversight doing that initial hydrology restoration. But still, you need that entity, that owner, that whoever it is for that site, understand that there is a commitment going forward. So I think now that for us, now that we've done some of these projects, and again, our scope is really limited, only 4 different projects. We've never done any spraying projects. They've been mainly sand, fine grained sand, but sand. I don't think we have a huge suite of projects moving forward. There's one more that we're thinking of right now in partnership with state agencies, but that's something that's first and foremost, who's going to be doing the long-term management. And now we have at least the beginnings of a playbook on what that will entail.
Adriana, I just want to add one more thing to the planting discussion. I think we've focused a lot on hydrology. One thing I will say is that one of the things I did learn is that, you know, sometimes you go into a sense of what you want to do with planting, like when your site's ready to plant. And I think a couple things that I've taken from that is that, you know, that are very helpful is that one of the big things we do, so when you actually are going into plantings, we intermix species a lot. Because sometimes, okay, you have a good handle. Yep, this is this elevation, this is this elevation. You know, they're going to grow. And then there's that spaces in between, or you have a lot of microtopography. We end up just intermixing species, different things like that, because something will take. Or you start getting kind of patches, which is actually kind of better habitat. So I think that's one of the things where, you know, I'm taking more of that of just not being overly prescriptive and just kind of going with it. One of the other things that we did is that, you know, at Prime Hook, we ended up having more material and ended up having more of a supra-tidal back barrier area that was more stable than what Wenley had dealt with. So some of the tactics we did to revegetate it, because again, we didn't want the plovers to have too much habitat. You know, we didn't want them to go too crazy. You know, things like, you know, doing rotary spraying of seed and then using a cultipacker to pack it into the sediment. So we didn't have to do plugs. So we did a 40-acre area in about like 6 hours. You know, and it was kind of like a novel approach to doing that using a mix of different switchgrasses and coastal panic grass, which does provide great habitat, but also kind of is used to these nutrient deficient sand areas. So and that's some of the adaptive management we had to do, as well as actually fertilizing a lot of these areas, going out and spraying fertilizer on them like you would an ag field, because there's no nutrients. And that was something we really didn't think about in the design of the project. And adaptively, you know, after that area seed and everything started coming up, it started to, you know, brown up with sowing that it didn't have enough nitrogen. So once we fertilized it, it kicked off. And even a lot of the Spartina patens we planted in the sand, we ended up having to use fertilizer in the hole to allow it to kind of really get going, especially the first couple of years, and not have like the sophomore slump and die off of, you know, basically being starved for nutrients. So those are some of the things that were kind of interesting. And, you know, use NRCS, places like that have a lot of good background on this type of stuff. Great resource to kind of help with some of these things you may not be thinking of. And especially, we also did a lot of work with them on different varieties of plants, especially Spartina patens Avalon variety, which is a back barrier plant that we used a lot. I wasn't familiar with this variety until before the project, but it actually turned out to be great. It has the same structure as Spartina patens, but it's more back dunal. So it can, you know, be inundated once a year. So it's like some of these things of just kind of, you know, being creative or using the experts to kind of modify your planting plan based upon like a lot of the stuff Wenley and I talked about, you know, being open to that and being creative, or also just asking the right technical questions can really kind of, you know, adaptively change your whole perspective.
I think it's really important with vegetation reestablishment being kind of that lowest bar of project success. And we'll kick that a little bit more around when we talk about monitoring programs and signs of success. But I think the temptation is, right, if the plants aren't coming in, put some plants in. And so ways to hedge those bets and not get rushed for the wrong reasons, and then use the creativity and the tools, the shared experience to hedge your bets and make sure that you're successful. That's all really useful information for us to be transferring. Go ahead, Wenli.
I just was going to, echo what Bart was saying. And Suzanne, that rack might be a hassle right now, and I wouldn't bother moving it until the spring, because there was a king tide or a storm tide 2 days ago. But it could be for some of these depression areas, you throw the rack there and keep it on site, and it's the seed source. As you know, at Quaney, it's amazing how much seed is out there. And EPA did a small little seeding experiment at the Quaney site. And it was so, whether or not actually doing some proactive seeding would help in the marsh. And it didn't really, I didn't see the final report, but just I observed it, and there wasn't really any difference. However, wherever there is a depression, that's where the seeds will collect, or along the upper edge, and take advantage of it. And you could have volunteers moving the rack to different areas and spreading the seed around.
It's a great point. We're winding down. I just want to allow Suzanne and Lisa to speak kind of their last bit of advice for adaptive management or site maintenance, if you have it to sprinkle in. Suzanne.
No, I don't really have anything to add above what others have said, except what maybe state the obvious, that it's worth having a conversation among the project team, because we always have multiple federal, state, local, NGO partners on any project, and having that decision made up front and working to secure the funding for 5 years or 10 years post restoration, adaptive management, and then monitoring and site maintenance just should be a part of every project. Yeah. And maybe we need to work with some of the funding agencies to have specific opportunities that will fund that work as standalone grant applications. Because once you get the money for the actual implementation and they can tick off the acres, then it's hard to go back and get funding. But the coastal program can fund post-restoration, adaptive management, and monitoring, but we just don't have a ton of money. But please.
Yeah, that would be nice. More of those opportunities for the post-construction monitoring. And I was just going to reiterate what's already been said about the vegetation, just like really making that a key over time, like where that's coming in, where it isn't, the natural recolonization, how that's happening, species that are coming in, and just paying attention to that, because that can also just lead to other changes that need to be modified for the project. So yeah, so not that much more to add, but I think just reiterating those key points. So thanks for the great discussion, Adriana.
Yes, I really appreciate everybody's participation, especially my presenters and panelists, and our audience as well. I really appreciate everybody tuning in and continuing to engage openly on this really exciting topic. I'm really excited that we're having a national conversation about the importance of these techniques, and really starting to share tips and tricks, because everyone doing these projects is learning something different, and it almost never makes it into the report. So I really appreciate everyone's generosity in sharing. I know the practice and our marshes are going to be better for